In this video, we'll talk about the importance of the risk manager getting the questions right. So you've identified the problems and opportunities. You've identified the objectives and constraints. Here's the point. You need information. Risk managers need information to know how to meet the objectives and how to avoid those constraints. So the risk managers have to ask their staff good questions to ensure that they get the information that they need from the risk assessment and the other data gathering tasks that will take place for this risk management activity. If risk managers don't get the questions right, then it's more likely than not you won't get the information that you need. And without the information that you need, a poor decision is far more likely. We've learned some lessons from risk analysis and risk management activities in a variety of places. We know that we need good science, sound evidence and information to address the risk issues that face us. Risk managers must ask for the information they need. Risk assessments done without questions to answer can produce information managers don't want to have, or they could fail to produce the information they need to make a good decision. Once you have framed your decision context by identifying the problems and opportunities, as well as your objectives and constraints, then the next most important step is to get the questions right. You're going to need information to meet your objectives, to solve your problems. So you need to ask for the information that you need. So the questions that you ask your risk assessors and your staff provide you with the information that you need to make a decision. These questions will guide the risk assessment and any other evaluations that are undertaken for your risk management activity. These questions should come from the risk managers, but with input from many others. The basics behind these questions are basically to ask yourself, what do we know about this problem, and what do we need to know? Risk analysis supports decision making by using science and evidence to identify what we know and what we do not know. Then risk analysis integrates this scientific knowledge and the uncertainty with social values in an effort to protect assets and social values, as well as to attain new opportunities for potential gain. Risk issues are often wicked problems. A wicked problem is an imprecisely defined problems. We all went through college on algebra and mathematical problems that were very precisely defined. When you have a flat tire, the solution is very precisely defined. But when you have citizens in your country who want to drink unpasteurized milk, and there are strong interests in the country who want to ban the consumption of raw pasteurized milk, there is no obviously right or wrong answer. There is no obviously right or wrong solution. But some solutions are better and some are worse than others. Wicked problems are complex and they require a great deal of information. I'd like to share a little of my experience with you. I've done a great deal of risk consulting over the years. And very often when I am called in to work on a project, it's not because things are going great. It's very often because the process has bogged down. Ordinarily, I listen and try to learn what people are dealing with. I ask for the problems and opportunities statement, and we rarely have one. I ask for objectives and constraints, and they're not often available. But when I meet with risk assessors, those folks who are trying to actually assess and measure the risks in some way, one of my favorite processes is to hand everyone a 3x5 index card. And on this card, I ask them to write the questions that they are trying to answer with their risk assessment. What questions are you trying to answer with the work that you are doing now? And I let people write down their questions, and then I collect the cards, and then I simply read them aloud. And so far, I have yet to come upon a situation where there is any kind of substantial agreement on the questions that a risk assessment is trying to answer. And it's at that point that I have people's attention, because it's very easy to ask then, how do you know what kind of data to collect? How do you know what kind of analysis to do? What kind of model can you possibly build when we have so many different ideas about what we're trying to accomplish with this risk assessment? So once you frame the decision, getting these questions right is critically important, because they guide everything that's going to happen afterwards. We professional people are often offended by comments that I'm going to make here about risk assessment questions, because we are all professionals, we are all well educated, and we've all dealt with problems for most of our lives. And these are things that we all agree with, but things that we rarely actually do in a systematic way. So when we talk about identifying these risk assessment questions, this set of questions must be available at the start of the risk assessment, so that I know, as your risk assessor, I will know what kind of data to collect. I will know what kind of information that you want at the conclusion of this assessment. These questions have to be specific. They can't remain in that vague land of what are the potential consequences? How do we reduce risk? Those kinds of questions are not specific enough. And the questions that you do get, they must be specified by risk managers. It's not the risk assessor's job to identify the questions to be answered by the assessment. If these questions are not written down on a piece of paper, then I would maintain they don't really exist. They are not real until they are written down. Once they're written down, you can refine them by negotiation. The managers, the assessors, and stakeholders all can refine these questions. You can point out the things that are missing, the things that are there that don't belong, and you can tweak the questions to make them more useful. The questions will change over time as you better understand your objectives, as you better understand the problems. Your information needs are going to become more clear. So you must keep the list of questions up to date. And everyone has to know what the questions are. Not just the risk assessors, but your stakeholders as well. And then, of course, risk assessors need to answer these questions as fully as they possibly can in the risk assessment itself. Let's focus for a second on how these questions prepared by the risk manager affect the risk assessment. Basically, this is how the risk assessment is scoped. The questions that you as a risk manager ask define the scope and the range of your risk assessment. These questions will help to define what will be included in the assessment or what will be excluded from the assessment. In addition, the nature of the questions will also help to determine how much detail is needed to answer these questions. Now let's turn our attention to the nature of these questions. What might these questions look like? It's not the easiest thing in the world to discuss these kinds of questions in any detail when we're trying to talk about risk management in a very broad context that includes so many communities of practice. So I'm going to offer you 4 rather broad categories of questions that would be appropriate, I think, in just about any kind of risk management application. But they do remain broad categories. There should be questions addressing the characterization of the risk. There should be questions about the objectives and the constraints. There should be risk mitigation questions and risk communication questions. And in the next couple of slides, I'll try to flesh those ideas out a little for you. Earlier in the class, you were provided with a brief introduction to risk assessment. At the time, you were presented with a generic risk assessment model that had 4 steps. The first step is looking for the hazard or opportunity. Second is a consequence assessment. And the third step is a likelihood assessment. All of the good work done in those first 3 steps is all pulled together in the 4th step of risk characterization. And this is where the good science and the evidence from those prior steps are all integrated in a way that provides risk managers with the information they need to manage the risks they face. Therefore, the place to begin when you, as a risk manager, are formulating questions to be answered by your risk assessment is with questions at the risk characterization level. This will assure that you get the information that you need to understand the risks that you face and to manage them as appropriate. A great deal of my own risk work has been in the area of natural resources. In the United States, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been tasked with the responsibility of providing people with flood risk management. They've been managing these risks for the better part of the century. So when a new flood risk is identified, the risk managers and the risk assessors as well already understand the questions that they're going to have to ask and answer, because these risks arise all the time and there are well-developed policies and procedures for assessing them. In a situation like this, risk managers can ask very high-level questions, and they can rely on their staff's experience to understand the details that they must attend to in order to answer those high-level questions. In other organizations, each risk may be unique. There may have been no opportunities to learn from prior experience or repeated exposures to these risks, and so the burden on risk managers to pose good questions is all the greater in those organizations. In these situations, risk managers might have to ask more questions, as well as more detailed questions, to assure that they get the information that they need to manage the risks. When thinking about risk characterization, it's important for risk managers to consider all of the relevant dimensions of a risk. So this would include the existing risk, residual risk, risk reductions, new risks, transferred and transformed risks, for example. We've already talked about the importance of your objectives and constraints. So when the time comes to request information and to pose questions to your risk assessors and other staff, it's important to focus on these objectives and constraints. How are you going to achieve your objectives? How are you going to avoid your constraints? What kinds of information do you need to have in order to know if your risk management options are going to achieve your objectives and avoid those constraints? So make sure that some of your questions provide you with the information that you're going to need to know that you can or cannot achieve your objectives and avoid your constraints. By the way, risk assessment provides many answers to these objective and constraint questions, but there will be some situations in which risk assessment may not answer all these questions. So the questions that you pose at this part in the risk management activity are for your risk assessors and for other stakeholders and staff members as well. So there may be legal questions that are outside the purview of a risk assessment, for example. There may be some questions about social values that would require surveys of the general public. It doesn't matter who will answer the questions. Now is the time to ask them. You wouldn't be engaged in a risk management activity if you weren't concerned about the risks that you face. So it's going to be important to make sure that you ask risk management questions, because if the risks that you are assessing turn out to be unacceptable, it would be entirely appropriate to manage those risks. So risk management questions include such things as: what kind of information do you need to have in order to formulate alternative solutions to the problem? What kind of information would you like to have in order to choose from among those alternatives the very best option? So that leads to some very obvious questions, such as: what options do we have? Which work best? What are other people doing about this problem? And so on. Then you need to think about the effectiveness of your risk management activities. Think ahead to that monitoring step. What information are you going to need to monitor the effectiveness of the actions that you take? What are the outcomes of interest? Now is the time to think about those things and pose those questions so that your risk assessors and your other staff will have the information you need at the time you're going to make a decision. People don't often think to formulate risk communication questions at this stage in the risk management process, but this is a good time to focus on the stakeholders and their perceptions. What are the most important things for the stakeholders to know about the risks that you're addressing? What things would the stakeholders most like to know? This is a little bit different about what you consider as the most important for them to know. This addresses the things that they want to know. And then you might also think about what points are stakeholders most likely to get wrong unless we emphasize and explain them. So these would be questions that you might pose at this stage in the risk assessment. Let's consider an example now, and once again I'm going to rely on my experience in food safety because we all know something about food. So we're going to look at an oyster example. Some years ago I was involved with a risk assessment that was looking at the risks of Vibrio parahemolyticus in raw oysters. As a risk manager, people often get down in the weeds and pay attention to details that are superficially important to them but don't provide them with the information they need. So for example, let's consider this oyster risk assessment. People would eat an oyster meal and some people get sick from them. Well, we were trying to find out how pervasive this problem was in the United States, particularly with respect to one specific bacteria. And so the risk managers initially ask questions like, what is the infectious dose? That basically means how many of these bacteria have to be in a gram of oyster flesh in order for people to get sick. Other people thought it would be important to know what the average meal size was. How much oyster flesh did people actually eat? And as it turns out, if we had provided those answers to risk managers, that would not help them decide how to manage this problem. So if instead of getting down in the weeds, they asked higher order questions like, how many people get sick in the United States each year from Vibrio parahemolyticus in raw oysters, that would be information that they could use, a number of people who get sick. Now, if I'm the risk assessor answering that question, I need to be concerned about the infectious dose and the average meal size and all of those other things. So they are important, but they are not important for risk managers to ask. They might also ask, how many illnesses will remain if we require people to cook all oysters, or if we require freezing of all oysters? This is one of those residual risk questions. Then it might be important to consider what our measures are going to do to the cost structure of the oyster industry. If we require all boats that watermen work on to have refrigeration units, that would be very costly and put a lot of people out of business. And then we would also have to ask, what will our measures do to the price of the commodity? Another example of questions would be, how much does the public already know about this issue? How much education are we going to have to provide? So these are just a couple of examples of the types of questions that you might ask for this oyster risk. Here's a reference to that risk assessment I was just speaking of. It was conducted in 2005. You also see here a number of questions that were posed by the risk managers to the risk assessors at the start of the risk assessment. And I put them here just to illustrate that indeed people are doing exactly these types of things that we're talking about here in this course. Having risk managers write the questions down is not the end of the process. It will be always necessary to discuss them and clarify them. The assessors and the managers must at some point sit together, talk about the questions and what they mean. They need to have a clear, common understanding of the questions. Once again, I will use food safety as an example. Some years ago, while involved with Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat foods, our risk managers wanted us to look at different food groupings to identify those food groupings that were the most risky. And so one of the groupings was cheese. And you would not believe the discussion, the debate that took place around what a cheese was or was not. There are many kinds of products that you and I may think of as cheese that experts would argue about. There are cheese foods and processed cheeses and natural cheeses and cheeses made with unpasteurized milk and so on and so forth. And so it was very necessary for us to spend quite a bit of time clarifying for one another what we mean by cheese. So it will be necessary not only to discuss, but to negotiate when necessary. Sometimes a question may not be complete. Sometimes it might not be a reasonable question. It may not even be possible to answer some questions. And if that's the case, risk managers have to hear that and know that very early on. You can't afford to wait to the end of a risk assessment to go back and to say, we are not going to be able to give you the information you need to make a decision. There are ways, of course, of dealing with the uncertainty, but one of those ways is at the very outset to ask clear questions, to discuss them, and to clarify them. There are a couple of things I would like you to remember. Risk analysis is an iterative process. It would be very rare to start at step one and proceed through it in a linear fashion. You are constantly backing up, repeating some steps, doing some things over, and so you should expect that your questions will change and evolve as you move through your risk management process. They will be clarified, they will be modified. Some questions will be deleted, new questions will be added as you move throughout the risk analysis process. That is to be expected. Risk assessment need not answer all the questions. There may be times when the risk managers have questions that are not science questions or not questions that would be ordinarily answered in a risk assessment. Some of the questions may require a legal analysis. A cost-benefit analysis might be required for some answers. And there could be many other kinds of analysis as well, public opinion polls, for example. So risk assessment isn't always needed to answer every risk manager's question. Sometimes a literature review, the risk profile, may provide sufficient science for risk managers to go ahead and make their decisions. In other instances, Other kinds of analysis, legal, economic, public opinion, might be appropriate. There are often going to be questions that may not have answers yet. And that, of course, is why we do risk analysis, to address these uncertainties. For emphasis, let me repeat. The output of this particular process is a sheet of paper that lists the specific questions that will be answered by the risk assessment and any other evaluations to be done for the risk managers. Date that list of questions because it will change and you will always need to know what the most current list of questions is. Make sure every team member has a current copy of the questions. Carry them in your pocket. They're that important. Risk assessment, the subject of a later course in our program, will answer these questions as completely as possible. We are now up to 3 pieces of paper, and I mean this quite literally. One piece of paper is a list of your problems and opportunities. The second piece is a list of your objectives and constraints. And the third piece of paper is the list of questions to be answered by your risk assessment and other evaluations. These 3 pieces of paper comprise the core of a risk profile, a subject of a later mini lecture.